Howl. And before going on to the poem, like yesterday, you saw what are the major features of beat poetry. Okay, so and you saw who are the main practitioners of the beat movement. So Allen Ginsberg is the founding father of the beat generation. Okay, and he's a visionary poet. He was very much influenced by William Blake. And this movement, as I've already told you, it's also alternatively called hippie culture. And you saw that it was a kind of rebellious movement against the institutional authority of the American establishment. And also, these people were disillusioned with World War II, the Holocaust, and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Ginsberg's style is essentially called, just like you have Pinterest style, Ginsberg's style is called the Ginsbergian style. And what, again, let us see what is special about the Ginsbergian style. We saw in yesterday's discussion that the beat movement is also one significant feature of the beat movement is that it is confessional. And what is confessional poetry? Poetry that reveals our innermost, deepest emotions, private experiences, clinical experiences, sexual guilt, sexual exploits, our fight with mental conflicts or depression, everything comes under confessional poetry. And it was also synonymous with an unfettered style. Unfettered style means a kind of disorganized style. There is it is synonymous with automatic writing. What come first thought is what is spent on the paper, and because of that the style is essentially instinctive. People write from their instinct, and there is no kind of proper organization. And because each person wrote from their instinct, this style is also highly individualistic or open. It is a kind of would you say it would be called more honest in its approach. And one significant aspect of Allen Ginsberg's style was that he was influenced by Walt Whitman. Especially Walt Whitman's use, if you've studied Walt Whitman's poetry, you will see that he uses very long lines. And it is not easy to write in long lines. After a while, it can seem monotonous or boring to write in long lines. It's easier to write. Those of you who are writing know that it's easier to write in short lines. To write in long lines is quite difficult, and but what Allen Ginsberg did was he took Walt Whitman's long lines and he made it into something dynamic. It was no longer static or monotonous or boring. He made it dynamic. And one significant feature that I forgot to mention yesterday of the beat poetry was the idea. Their poetry has been synonymous with travel, the theme of travel, and also speed. Howl, especially the poem that you're going to study, it was supposed to be uttered in a single breath. Wait a second, somebody has joined. Who is this? Okay, I suppose that they're joining from somebody else's ID. Okay, Howl especially was supposed to be uttered in a single breath. Like you have that song Breathless. That song is supposed to be uttered in one single breath. Similarly, Howl also was supposed to be uttered in a single breath, and that is why it is it has these features of beat movement. I told you one significant feature that I forgot to mention yesterday was the theme of travel and speed. So that is why you find the lines itself. I told you there the lines have a run-on effect. You don't have any proper pausing punctuation like a full stop of a comma, but one line runs on to the next with the technique of enjambment. As I told you in that class on Robert Frost, Robert Frost in Mending Wall, he has this tendency to break boundaries. Here also, I told you the beat movement was uh, it was particularly anti-establishment. It was against the establishment. There was this tendency to break boundaries, and therefore symbolic of the same, they tended to use, the technique of enjambment, without, there's no full stop or punctuation, their tendency to break boundaries. And that's why he makes use of this dynamic long line, and it attains a kind of kinetic movement. You don't feel it is static. And yesterday we had discussed these aspects also, that sexualized aspects and the idea of eroticism that is that you constantly find in beat movement. And then also the idea of free verse. Ginsbergian style makes use of free verse. That again, there you find the tendency to break boundaries. And again, as I told you, because it was anti-establishment, uh, they were kind of disillusioned, all the principles that you found in the American Declaration of Independence. They found that the American government was no longer practicing all those principles on democracy also. And since they found the this kind of betrayal of American democracy, you find the sense of disillusionment with the establishment, and this theme is reflected again and again in Ginsberg and other beat poets' poetry. And another figure of speech that constantly figures or appears in Allen Ginsberg's poetry is anaphora. Anaphora is a figure of speech where, a, a a word or a group of words, when it is repeated at the beginning of each line, it is called anaphora. For example, in Howl, you find that who is repeated again and again. In America, you find the word America is repeated at the beginning. And this is also another significant feature of the uh, beat poets or Allen Ginsberg. They tend to use biblical motifs, not motive, Tive, but motifs. Motifs, and here, what is a motive? The idea in the Bible, you find the idea of repetition coming again and again. So, anaphora is also a kind of a biblical ploy or biblical motive of repetition. And why do we use repetition? We use repetition to reinforce something or to underline some idea. So this is why he makes use of anaphora again and again. And also, Allen Ginsberg himself says that since I found myself a bit handicapped, he was not confident enough to use these long lines. Therefore, anaphora was a crutch for him to write freely. He found a kind of confidence when he used the figure of speech called anaphora. And in the poem America also, you find that he experiments with a mixture of longer and shorter lines. And Howl, as I told you, the theme of speed comes in Howl, and because of that, it should be read in a single breath as a single word. That is why there should be no punctuation in between. And yesterday, while doing the features of beat poetry, we saw that it was influenced by postmodernism. And in postmodernism, we find this kind of fragmented narrative, and we find this in the Ginsbergian style also. The Ginsbergian style, you find fragmented images, fragmented sentences, and temporal distortion. Temporal distortion means the concept of time itself is distorted. We'll see how this happens in this poem. But through temporal distortion, you find that the features of postmodernism are coming in, and this non-linear timeline. Everything is not happening in a linear kind of narrative. That the concept there is fragmentation of narrative, and there is also distortion of temporality, or time is distorted. Like for example, when you watch certain movies, you see that the movie is not presented in a linear kind of uh, narrative, but everything they go you they there is flashback, then you come back again, then flashback again. So that kind of non-linear timeline you find in beat poetry or the Ginsbergian style also. And the tone is of course angry, because you find a lot of angry young men, because I told you, because their poetry was essentially rebellious. It was politically dissident, because it was against the mainstream American society and also against institutional authority. And you find the stream of consciousness style. I told you it is automatic writing. So you don't find a kind of coherent narrative or a proper linear narrative. Whatever first comes to your consciousness is presented there. So that is how it is a stream of consciousness style. And also they make use of maximalism. Maximalism means, there are not short lines, but long lines, a lot of descriptions. There are, and these lines are lengthy, and all the descriptions are highly detailed. You find digressions. Digressions. പെട്ടെന്ന് ഒരു കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് പിന്നെ ഒരു കാര്യത്തിലേക്ക് they tend to digress. We go out of context. Then a lot of allusions, lot of references. It is thoroughly disorganized. All this comes under maximalism. And then you have personal allusions, personal references, personal, probably autobiographical references, historical allusions, and also religious allusions. And as I have already told you, repetition. One example is anaphora, the repetition of a word or a group of words at the beginning of a line. It is a biblical motif or a biblical plot. It is used again and again. Why do we use repetition? If I were to tell you something and again, it is for emphasis or to reinforce some point. And again, uh, there is juxtaposition of imagery, sometimes illogical imagery also. And I told you they were significantly influenced by surrealism. And what were some of the features of surrealism? Automatic writing, illogical juxtaposition of images, personal iconography. All this you find in surrealism. And Howl is said to be the foremost poetic expression of the beat generation of the 1950s. In the beginning, it was written in a stepped triadic style. Stepped triadic style means when you look at the poem, it is like the form. It is in the form of an inverted pyramid. That shows, probably it shows not a progression but regression. I hope all of you are familiar with concrete poetry. When the shape of the poem echoes the theme, it is called concrete poetry. For example, I have written a poem about a kite. The shape of the poem is like this. I have written a poem about the Taj Mahal. The shape of the poem is like this. So when the form echoes the theme, it is called concrete poetry. And similarly, Howl was initially written in a stepped triadic style, like an inverted staircase, probably echoing not progression but regression. Because society was not progressing, but society was regressing. And these things we have already discussed. And then lamentation, it was a cry. Why were they crying? Because they were crushed against the heavy dominance of American mainstream society and establishment. And it is also in the form of Jeremiah, a list of complaints, a list of complaints. If you find, the whole poem is like a list of complaints, and it is also under the influence of drugs. It is also in the form of a vision. And you see that there is though sexuality is celebrated in the house, it is definitely male centric. There is, you women are completely marginalized in the picture, and therefore it is a celebration and critique of masculinity. And this howl, just like you say, the preface to the lyrical ballads, the preface to the lyrical ballads became an unofficial manifesto of the romantic movement. The howl was actually anthem of the 1950 beat poets. And as I've already mentioned, it is a song of liberation from sorry, not it is not from but against a conformist society, and they rebelled against the society. And one significant theme of the poem is insanity. There are a lot of themes. It is anti-establishment, political rebellion, madness, poetic inspiration, creative inspiration, There are a number of themes in the poem, but one particular theme that I want to mention here especially was madness, because uh, Allen Ginsberg's mother was uh, a victim of depression, and he was the person who used to often accompany her to the mental assignment. Her name was Naomi Ginsberg, and his mother and her insanity are said to be an inspiration for Howl, and also the poem Kaddish, often considered as Ginsberg's greatest work. And he was also formidably influenced by the mountain poets, the New York poets, and Leroy Jones, who later became Amiri Baraka. And significantly, Leroy Jones, he sent his review of Howl to Allen Ginsberg on toilet paper, written on toilet paper. That says a lot about these poets. And I've already told you that he was significantly influenced by his mother, Naomi Ginsberg, and her encounter with insanity or madness. And Carl Solomon also was a mental patient, and it was some of his conversation with Carl Solomon also that resulted in Howl, and that is why uh, Allen Ginsberg has dedicated this poem to Carl Solomon. Okay, so this is how the poem begins. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. The best minds of his generation, all these beat poets that we have mentioned, Burroughs, Gary Sinder, Jack Kerouac, all of them, they were destroyed by madness. What kind of madness? They were the best minds of his generation, but they were repressed against this institutional authority, the main American mainstream society, the policies of the American government that they could not agree to, and therefore they were destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. And now, are these people were they poor by default? But no, I told you yesterday that most of these beat poets they were from privileged backgrounds, but they chose to give up their job because they did not want to conform to these government policies of principles, and therefore voluntarily they gave up their jobs and they took up small time jobs, and that is why they are starving from poverty. Hysterical, naked. In what way are they naked? They are naked because, firstly, because under the influence of drugs, their mind is spiritually naked. When you are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, your mind tends to be its naked best. You utter out all, you're more honest. Secondly, they in the state of utter ecstasy, these people also were found in the half naked state. So there are two meanings there, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. So these people, they drag themselves through the Negro streets. Now, why are the streets called Negro streets? Firstly, because the streets, uh, those streets in New York were inhabited by Afro American people. That is the first meaning. And some critics say that during the dawn, these people, most of these Afro Americans, they had morning shifts, and most of them used to go for the morning shift, and that is another reason why Allen Ginsberg makes use of the phrase "Negro streets." At dawn, looking for an angry fix. Fix is drugs. Now, can you call the drugs angry fix? Are the drugs angry by default? But no. So, what is the figure of speech used there? Anybody? What is the figure of speech used in the term angry fix? Are the drugs fixes angry? As fix is another word for drugs. So, can drugs be angry? What is the figure of speech used there? Good, Kripa. It is transferred epithet. It is good, Kripa. It is transferred epithet. And how is it a transferred epithet? Because the drugs are not angry by default, but the people are angry. And therefore, it is an instance of transferred epithet. When you transfer one quality from one plane onto other. Suppose I come to your class and tell you this is such a happy, we have such a happy classroom today. Actually, the classroom is not happy, but the students in the class are happy, and therefore that is an example for transferred epithet. Angel headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of the night. Angel headed. Are these people actually angel headed? Do they have a halo around their head? No, they do not have a halo around their head, but under the influence of drugs, they find themselves on a high. Is somebody mute? Somebody please mute your mic. Somebody has switched on their microphone. Okay. So these people, they are not angelic, but it is their sense, the ecstasy of drugs that they find themselves in a high under the influence of drugs, and that is why they are called angel-headed hipsters. Hipster is a term used found in the glossary of the times. It refers to people who like hot jazz. Hot jazz. I told you yesterday the beat poets were closely affiliated with jazz music. So it is uh, a term given to people who like hot jazz, and they burned for these people were burning for the ancient burning. When do you burn? There are two meanings again there. The burning of cigarettes, and also burning passionate for the ancient heavenly connection. Under the influence of drugs, they want to, you want to go into seventh heaven. You like to go on a high, that anciently heaven connection. Also, this connection to heaven was also kind of mentioned by critics to be a reference to Dylan Thomas's poem, "The Force That Through the Green." What is it? The force that through the green fuse drives the flower. It is also a reference to that particular poem, and also uh, Allen Ginsberg had met Dylan Thomas once, and he was deeply influenced by Dylan Thomas. And you find this trait in his poems also. The use of strange collocations. Strange collocations means a collocation means where one word goes with another. For example, we don't say take a class. We don't directly translate from Malayalam. Rather, we say engage a class, or you don't hear, or you say he delivered a speech. There's certain words go with each other. That is what you call collocations. But you will, just like Dylan Thomas, you find that Allen Ginsberg also breaks the rules of these collocations, and that is why Dylan Thomas uses has usages like once above a time, once below, once above a time, once below a time. You have such usages in Dylan Thomas, and similarly, I find that tendency in Allen Ginsberg also. So these angel-headed hipsters were burning for an ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of the night. So all these references to starry dynamos and heavens, it is a allusion to Dylan Thomas's poem "In the Machinery of the Night." So these people, under the influence of drugs, they want to be one with the universe. They want to be in the seventh heaven and find themselves to be also machinery of the night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across the tops of cities contemplating jazz. So their poverty, and because of their poverty, they are wearing torn clothes. They are in tatters. They are wearing torn clothes and hollow-eyed. Hollow-eyed is again an oxymoron, or a juxtaposition of opposite images. Hollow is something hollow. Eyes is something bulging. That is why it is, in terms of imagery, it is a oxymoron. Like for example, you have Robert Frost's home burial. Home is something that comes above the ground, and burial is something that comes below the ground like this. So that is, home burial is also taken as an example of oxymoron. Similarly, you find hollow-eyed as an example of oxymoron. And high, they are on a high because they are under the influence of drugs, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness. Is the darkness actually supernatural? No, the darkness is not actually supernatural, but it is the influence of drugs that they feel they are going, they are one with the stars and the moon, and it is the influence of drugs that makes them feel that the darkness is supernatural. So that is also an example of transferred epithet, or what you call hyperlegy. Another name for transferred epithet is hyperlegy, hypellage. Supernatural darkness of cold water flats. Flats, apartments, what we call here flats in India also. And now it is illegal to have cold water flats. All these flats are supposed in America, not in India. All these flats are supposed to have hot water. But since these people were poor, they were financially not very well off, and that's why they stayed in these cold water flats, floating across the top of cities, contemplating jazz. Now, you people might have seen, some rooms or flats standing on the terrace, on the tenement, uh, and standing alone. And most all these activities mostly happen on the terrace. Whether people have alcohol or drugs, it happens on the topmost part of a building or the terrace. And this is why they found themselves to be floating, because they are at the top. They found themselves to be floating across the top of cities, contemplating jazz. They were thinking about jazz music. And these, you here see, I already told you that Allen Ginsberg makes use of anaphora. And here, what is the example of anaphora? Phora, you see who repeating here? Who, who, a line that is repeated, a line or a word or a group of words that is repeated at the beginning of a line. This is an example of anaphora. So you find who is repeated, who pass through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas, and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in waste baskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York. So you see who is an example for anaphora. And who passed through, now these best minds of his generations, they passed through universities. And Allen Ginsberg studied at the Columbian University, and the best minds of his generation passed through these prestigious universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas. Now, Arkansas is a South American state with a rural population. So you see that though these people have essentially city vibes. They're talking about big cities. At the same time, they're also thinking about these small time states with rural population. So there is a juxtaposition of the rural and the urban. I told you this is juxtaposition is a significant feature of the beat poets. And these the best minds of his generation, they passed through these universities with radiant, cool eyes, having hallucinations about Arkansas. This you see under the influence of drugs, they are having hallucinations about Arkansas, and also Blake light tragedy. I already told you that uh, Allen Ginsberg himself is a visionary poet, and he was also formidably influenced by the mystical and visionary poet William Blake. William Blake, uh, and he in his vision there was Allen Ginsberg also got a vision where William Blake was actually reading his poems. So that is a reference to William Blake here. Blake like tragedy among scholars of war. Now see, though these people were bright, though they were the best minds of his generation, though they were also intellectuals, what did the universities do? Did they give them much importance? No. They gave this in the same university, they gave the scholars of war more importance. The scholars of war means the students or scholars who contributed to the uh, knowledge of splitting atoms, or how to create nuclear energy, or how to create weapons of mass destruction. These scholars were given more importance than the best minds or intellectual minds of his generation. So you understand that I already told you that in the 1940s and 50s, this beat movement emerged essentially as a disillusionment with the war, with the Second World War, with the Cold War, with the Holocaust, all these tendencies that was happening in the background. And this is why you find this disillusionment with the government and also the university that is actually promoting these scholars of war. And these best minds of his generation were actually these scholars of war were respected, and these best minds of his generation, they were expelled or permanently suspended from the universities for their crazy activities and for publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull. This There is a reference here once when the Columbian University president had come there. uh, Allen Ginsberg had published something vulgar on the window of of his dorm room, and therefore he had a run-in. There was a conflict between him and the Columbian University president. So there is a allusion to that here for crazy and publishing odes on the windows of the skull. Why is now the university is called a skull? Why is it called a skull? Because universities are supposed to be the centers for enlightenment, as the centers of intellect, that are supposed to enlighten mind. But by calling the university a skull, he's saying it was only a shell outside. Inside it was totally hollow. Who covered, and these bench minds of his generation, they passed through universities, they were expelled from the academies for all these activities. They covered in unshaven rooms. And again, are the rooms unshaven? No. Again, there is a example of transferred epithet there. It was the people, because you could find these people in their, what do you say, the most, their rawest forms. They, in their most instinctive, individualistic persona, in their, they did not even find the need to shave. So that is why the rooms are called unshaven rooms in underwear. They, again, we saw that they are found in their half naked state, burning their money in waste baskets. Are they burning their money? No, normally when I find some of my uncles using this reference there. When you're bursting firecrackers, you're actually wasting your money. So they say you're actually burning your money. Similarly, here, burning their money means burning their money. Uh, uh, using cigarettes or drugs. And that is what they call burning their money in waste baskets, the depositing of the ash of cigarettes, and listening to the terror through the wall. Terror with the capital T. So terror T stands for that the institutional authority of the university, of the mainstream American society, of the American establishment, and also America as Big Brother. All these references are brought in through the capitalization of the word T. Who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York. So these best minds of his generation, they got busted. Busted means raided. Suddenly you have an income tax raid or the police raid. So these people, the Laredo is actually a place on the Mexican border, Texas, where drugs are sold for cheap. So these people, they buy drugs from there, and they try, and when they try to return to New York, when they are returning to New York with a belt of marijuana, they get raided in their utter naked state, in their pubic beards, in their utter naked state, they get raided by the police. And these best minds of his generation, they ate fire in paint hotels. They ate fire means they ate fire in paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, death or purgatoried their torsos night after night. So these best minds of his generation, They ate fire in paint hotels. Again, eating fire is against smoking. Eating fire is against smoking. We already saw that burning money in waste baskets. So this Paradise Alley, this particular place, is famous for being a place where most of the artists resided. Most of the artists resided in this particular place called Paradise Alley, and they stayed in rooms that in hotels where they were that needed a lot of repair. So that is why there's a reference to paint hotels. So they were they these rooms were in need of repair, and that is why in need of repair and paint, and that is why there is a reference to paint hotels and drank turpentine. So, and not only that, in the utter state of ecstasy, drugs, and on being after being on a high, these people resort to all sort of unimaginable things. So that is why you have all these references: ate fire, definitely smoking cigarettes in paint hotels, or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, death or purgatory their torsos night after night. This critic, this reference, critics say that it shows the utter kind of spiritual torture that they felt, the kind of spiritual torture they felt, that and they need to purify themselves night after night. So this kind, their exploits with drugs was a kind of spiritual purification for them. I told you they needed some kind of escapism. They could not bear the repression from the government, from this establishment, and they needed some kind of escapism, or need to purify themselves. Like you find this kind of parallel, it is a kind of spirit for them, it is a kind of spiritual purification. Like for example, you have a paradoxical reference in John Donne's canonization. He says that through our worldly sexual love, we will reach the divine stature of heavenly saints. That is the argument that John Donne makes in the canonization, that through our worldly act of sexual love, we will reach the unworldly, or divine stature of heavenly states. So through this kind of worldly acts, they are trying to spiritually purify themselves. And how? With dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares. Sometimes we have very bad nightmares at night, and we tend to wake up. Alcohol and cock and endless balls. So cock and endless balls, these all are sexual connotations, cock and endless balls. And also, when you say you're having a ball, it has another meaning. When you have a great time, you say you're having a ball. So there are two connotations there. The opposite of incomparable is incomparable. It is pronounced as incomparable. Incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind, leaping towards poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between. Now, are these streets actually blind? No. These people in their uh, with, with their exploit with drugs and sex, and in their bohemian lifestyle. Bohemian lifestyle means pleasure seeking, the pleasure seeking lifestyle. It is called bohemian. And with their bohemian lifestyle, they had actually become blind, and that is why these, you could not even compare it to anything else, and that is why it is called incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind. And there was not cloud and lightning outside, but there was cloud and lightning in the mind, showing their utter turmoil, or the kind of repression and conflict that they faced, leaping towards poles of Canada and Patterson. And uh, uh, Allen Ginsberg was born in Patterson, New Jersey. There's another poet who was born in Canada. I'll come back to that. I'll say who it was in the next class. Okay, we'll come back to that in the next class. So this is the reference to their childhood birthplaces. Ginsberg was born in Patterson, New Jersey, and another poet, I don't remember who it was. He was French Canadian. Okay, So that is why you have the references to their birthplaces. So just imagine the utter conflict in their mind. They break the concept of time also. So there is a, yeah, it's like a time machine. They right now in the present, and then they go. They are not only traveling. In this poem also you find the concept of travel. They are shuttling from one place to another, and they are not only shuttling physically. There is also the mind is also traveling. At one point they are leaping from they are in these streets at one time, in these particular streets, and again in New York, and then they are traveling. There is mind travel also towards poles of Canada and Patterson, their birthplaces, illuminating all the motionless of world of time between. So just when they are doing mind traveling, it seems that time is standing still. That is why it is called motionless world of time between. There are two references there. When they are doing this mind traveling, the idea of temporality is, I told you earlier, the idea of temporality is, what do you say, it is, they try to dismantle it, the idea of temporal, that idea of linear narrative. They try to fight against it, and therefore through the idea of mind travel, the concept of time becomes static and they become more kinetic when you do mind travel. That is one meaning. The second meaning is, when they go back to their birth time, and then they come back. So that the time from their birth till this time has been uneventful, because nothing significant, nothing important has happened till now. It is only from this point, when they start all these activities, that they feel they are actually living life, and something eventful is happening in their life. And that is why the moment from that till this time seems motionless. So those are the two meanings there.